No, that's a really good explanation and background. I want to ask you, Eugene, if you can place this in a bit of a broader context in the sense of, okay, so that you have these two warring factions that are a part of different parts of basically the ruling class of the ruling, like I guess dictatorship class, if you want to call it that. Um, so then the question becomes, can you talk a little bit about the foreign influence here? Are either of these sides being backed by outside powers, whether regionally or perhaps from the West at all? And can you maybe place, and I know this is actually a complicated question because it's not so black and white, but can you place what's happening in Sudan in the context of the imperialist struggle? Because I think a lot of people who probably watch or listen to our show are wondering, okay, obviously something terrible is happening in Sudan. There was an uprising a few years ago, the revolution you just talked about, and all these things have been happening since. But how is the US responsible? Who does the US back here? Who do US allies in the region back here? What about Gulf states? So are there people from outside putting their hands into this conflict? And if so, how and why?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of players who are involved in this conflict, and I think we have to take some steps back, and it's becoming a sort of big issue. And now you have CNN trying to blame the whole thing on Russia. So we're now into this just like
Right.
unbelievable, like flat, one-dimensional view of Sudan, which is just fraudulent. I just have to say that the presentation by Nima Al-Bagher around Russia and other things, it's just, I mean, there's some facts in there, but by and large, it's so manipulated. It's to me fraudulent. But we have to take one step back again to the turfing out of al-Bashir, the removal of him from his position as president by these forces. So how did these military forces actually, make this work? Because you had all these people who were up in the streets, millions of people. They were like, get rid of all these people. So how did some of them stick around? Well, they stuck around because the US, the EU, and the Gulf states were for them. And they were for them because these individuals, when they got rid of al-Bashir, understood that there were elements of the National Congress Party rule in Sudan that was hated by the West. Al-Bashir was hated by the West. And there are a lot of different reasons why. One major one is that Sudan, historically, going back to the 1960s, is, I'd say other than maybe Iran, probably the strongest supporter of the Palestinian people. There was very, very powerful support, weapons, guns, people could live there, all these kind of things. So hated by the West for other reasons too, but that was a big one. And so they knew, these forces, SAF, RSF, the regime type forces, the ruling elites who were tied to the military, who wanted to stick around in power, that they could get a powerful friend if they were willing to serve some of the interest that had been targeting him. And so al-Bashir, that is. And so ultimately they agreed to do a few different things and to be the guarantors of a few different realities. One, they were going to support an IMF World Bank regime of austerity in terms of the economy of Sudan, and that they essentially were going to, sell the country for parts, which also included a continuation of something that had begun under al-Bashir, which is selling off huge tracts of land to Gulf states in order to have their agribusiness and agriculture working there. So they were going to continue that. So that obviously was going to make a lot of players happy in the centers of power in the West and in the centers of power in the various Gulf states. On top of that, they were going to join the Abraham Accords and normalize relations with Israel, which obviously was a huge push by the Trump administration, by the Biden administration, and really, quite frankly, a coup in and of itself. I mean, no one could imagine that Sudan would normalize relations with Israel. And to some degree, it's only on paper, but nonetheless, you can see that also gained support for them. And then you have the context of some of the other countries in the region, like Egypt and others, who, ultimately did not want to see, and this goes back to the issue of the Arab Spring, a Sudanese government that was going to have some form of popular democracy, because that could then potentially spill over into Egypt, challenges to the al-Sisi regime. So they also generally were like, yeah, good to have the military in there, kind of keeping things together. So you have a collusion of these imperial powers and some regional powers. They actually set up a grouping, the so-called Quad, which is now kind of morphed into something called the Trilateral Mechanism as well, or they've supported it. But it's basically the U.S., some Scandinavian states, the Gulf states, and a couple European states, in conjunction with the UN and others who they've brought in, who formed essentially a grouping that was like, okay, yeah, this is what we want. We want there to be a fig leaf of democracy. So we'll have a civilian military government. But we want to make sure that at the core of that, these core concerns, the IMF, World Bank, austerity type policies, normalization with Israel, selling off land to the highest bidder, and so on, would be determined. But these are also very savvy political players. So they understood that, to the extent they were only relying on the West, they would not really be able to determine their own agenda. So both the Al Burhan and Hemeti have actually gone somewhat out of their way to develop relations with Russia as well. Russia has a long history, also working with the previous government in Sudan. They're involved in the mining industry and so on and so forth. And so to some degree, they were trying to kind of leverage that against these sort of Western powers. So there's been this sort of shadow game going on, in the course of this, because you have this challenge since the coup in 2021, where the Western powers especially feel they don't like that, because then it has destroyed their whole thing about how they're supporting democracy in Sudan. But they don't want real democracy in Sudan. So there's something that many people in Sudan call the soft landing that has been pursued for the past a number of months. And that is a negotiation to return to the pre-coup status quo, where the sort of military forces will remain the sort of key players, the sort of system, as it were, that is very much serving the sort of international economic interest and the geopolitical interest of some of these forces will basically remain. But then there'll be some quote unquote civilian component that will, bring back this fig leaf of democracy. So you've got different people who've been pushing on different sides. Egypt, for instance, has been basically trying to sabotage this agreement, because from their perspective, this is just my own personal belief, but I think we can see it here. They would prefer the government of Sudan to be more like the government of Egypt, for the reasons I mentioned before, in terms of, I think, some of their own internal politics, and also how I think they want to try to have the region be oriented, and how they like to have, interact with other countries in the region. But then you also have the vast majority of international forces supporting this quote unquote framework agreement to return to the pre-coup status quo, and putting a lot of pressure on the military to come to some agreement with some quote unquote civilians. And that's kind of, I think, the nature of where we are. I don't think that the foreign influence is necessarily a controlling factor in what's happening, but it created a space where ultimately it was clear that there was no way for the sort of military forces to hang on in the coup reality. They were going to be probably, pushed and forced and bullied by their partners in the quote unquote international community to do something. And so then it was like, okay, well, if we have to do something, then, who is ultimately going to determine what that something is? And that's how the two sides are fighting. And there's a lot of kind of Byzantine elements to it as well, because, some of the people who are opposed to the framework agreement, are these former armed insurgencies, many of them from Darfur, who had signed a peace agreement with the government, who feel that this was an opportunity to change the sort of regional balance of power in the country, which is a big issue. And then you also have the mass movement on the streets, the resistance committees, thousands of committees all around the country. We could talk more about them, who don't want any negotiations with the military. And they've been pushing a vision that is against the IMF, against the normalization of relations, for free healthcare, for free education. So they're trying to do everything possible to keep them out of power as well. You've got this kind of multi-sided fight based on the sort of hierarchical differences between the regions in Sudan, where there's a lot of inequality between the regions and the center. You've got the sort of class-based reality about, the difference between the poor and the elite. Then you've got the inner elite battles in between themselves, all kind of overlaying on top of one another, to create what's a pretty complex landscape. But what basically boils down to this: is Sudan going to be a country that goes along with the sort of dictates of Western powers and the Gulf states about how to act in the region and about what sort of internal domestic policies they're going to have? Or is there going to be a more sort of popular democratic alternative that would move away from some of those elements and start to break apart the sort of traditional military elite economic control nexus, as it were? So a lot of complicated factors in terms of how that's all playing out.